A widow, a child, a blizzard, and a dead man's blood freezing on her coat. She didn't knock on that door looking for love. She was looking for one more minute of life. But the broken, battle-scarred recluse who opened it hadn't felt anything in 15 years. What happens when two people with nothing left to lose find each other in the eye of the storm? This story reminds us that sometimes the worst storm of your life isn't sent to destroy you. It's sent to deliver you exactly where you were always meant to be. Welcome to Frontier Hearts, where every story is forged from the raw, untamed spirit of the Old West. If that moved something in you, like this video, drop a comment and subscribe, because the next story might just be the one that changes everything.
The wind did not howl, it screamed. Clara Hayes tasted the metallic tang of her husband's blood every time she drew a ragged breath. It was seeping into the collar of her wool coat, freezing into stiff, dark crusts against her skin. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she turned her head, she would see the orange glow of torches bleeding through the blinding white curtain of the blizzard. She would hear the rhythmic crunch of Judson Croft's bounty hunters closing the distance. Instead, she focused on the tiny, trembling hand locked in her own. "Keep moving, Lily. Just a little further, sweetie," Clara gasped, her voice instantly swallowed by the roar of the storm. Beneath her heavy wool bodice, pressed flat against her racing heart, lay the crumpled, blood-stained land deed. It was the only reason her husband was currently lying dead on the floor of their homestead, and the only reason Croft's men had orders to shoot her on sight. The cold was an agonizing physical weight. This wasn't just a winter storm, it was the worst blizzard to hit Table Mountain in a decade, dropping temperatures to a lethal extreme that froze the moisture in Clara's lungs. That was the first trap. The wilderness was actively trying to kill them. The second trap was the geography. The snowdrifts were already waist-high in the ravines, funneling them upward, away from the safety of the valley town and deeper into the desolate, jagged crags of the mountain. They were being herded. A gunshot cracked through the timberline, dull but terrifyingly close. Bark exploded from a pine tree just inches from Clara's shoulder. She shoved Lily forward, diving behind a massive snow-covered boulder. Clara's lungs burned as she pulled her daughter against her chest, wrapping her body around the 7-year-old in a futile attempt to shield her from the biting wind and the bullets. "Mama, I can't feel my boots," Lily whimpered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "I know, baby, I know." Clara frantically scanned the darkness. To their left was a sheer drop. To their right, the torches were spreading out in a calculated arc. Croft's men were sweeping the ridge. Then she saw it. Barely 50 yards away, obscured by the violent swirl of white, a faint square of yellow light flickered against the dark silhouette of the mountain. A cabin. "Look!" Clara pushed Lily to her feet. "A house! Run, Lily! Run to the light!" They broke from cover, fighting through knee-deep snow. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Clara's legs felt like lead, her vision swimming with black spots. Behind them, a voice shouted, a rough, triumphant sound. They had been spotted. 20 yards. 10. Lily stumbled on a hidden root and went down hard. Clara tried to haul her up, but her own knees gave out. They collapsed against the solid, unyielding wood of a heavy oak door. Clara raised a numb fist to pound on the wood. But before her knuckles could connect, the heavy iron latch clattered loudly. The door swung inward, dragging the howling storm inside. Clara fell forward onto a braided rug, gasping for air. Standing above them was a mountain of a man. Silas Vance looked as weathered and unyielding as the rock his cabin was built upon. He was in his early 50s, with silver threaded through his dark, disheveled hair and a thick, rugged beard. But it was his eyes that froze Clara in place. Pale, flinty, and completely hollowed out. In his massive, calloused hands, he held a lever-action Winchester rifle, casually angled but entirely ready. Silas looked down at the blood soaking Clara's coat, then past her, into the howling dark where the torches were cresting the hill. He didn't ask if they were lost. He didn't offer a warm blanket. He simply stood there, an immovable object, assessing the violence they had dragged to his doorstep. Lily pushed herself up onto her frozen knees. She looked up at the towering, intimidating stranger, tears freezing on her pale cheeks. "Please hide my mom," the little girl sobbed, her voice cracking with a desperate, devastating innocence. "Please." Silas Vance's jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek ticked once. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He reached out with one massive hand, gripped Clara by the collar of her coat, and hauled her inside like she weighed nothing at all. He pulled Lily in behind her and slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing a thick iron bolt into place with a definitive thud. "Get away from the door," Silas growled, his voice deep and gravelly, like stones grinding together. Clara scrambled backward, pulling Lily into the shadows near the stone fireplace. "Thank you," she rasped, shivering uncontrollably. "They killed my husband. They're coming for—" She never finished the sentence. The blizzard wasn't their ultimate test tonight. It was merely the bait. Before Silas could even turn away from the entryway, the front window exploded inward. A deafening crash of shattered glass and splintered wood rained across the cabin floor, accompanied by the roar of a shotgun blast. The bounty hunters hadn't lost the trail at all. They had followed the blood straight to the porch. Snow and wind blasted through the broken frame, extinguishing the oil lamps and plunging the room into chaotic darkness. Clara screamed, covering Lily's body with her own. Silas didn't flinch. In one fluid, terrifyingly practiced motion, the old rancher kicked over a heavy oak table for cover, pumped the lever of his Winchester, and leveled the barrel toward the shattered window. The quiet, isolated rancher was gone. In his place stood a man who knew exactly how to kill, and who had just decided he didn't mind doing it again. "Keep your head down, widow," Silas ordered over his shoulder, his voice completely devoid of fear. Then he pulled the trigger. The roar of the Winchester in the confined space of the cabin was deafening, a concussive wave that rattled the iron pans hanging above the stove and punched the air right out of Clara's lungs. Silas worked the lever with a terrifying mechanical rhythm. Crack, clack, clack, crack. Brass casings spun through the freezing air, pinging against the floorboards like deadly hail. From outside the shattered window, a man screamed, a wet, guttural sound that was abruptly swallowed by the howling wind. A heavy thud vibrated through the porch planks. Another shotgun blast answered blindly from the dark, the buckshot chewing into the thick oak logs of the cabin's exterior. But Silas had already dropped below the sill, his breathing perfectly even. Clara kept her body draped over Lily, her hands pressed tightly over her daughter's ears. She was shaking so violently her teeth ached, her eyes squeezed shut against the raining glass and the biting snow that was now pouring through the broken window. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the shrieking blizzard. Silas rose slowly, keeping to the shadows. He leveled the rifle barrel over the jagged glass, his pale eyes tracking the darkness. He stayed like that, a statue carved from granite and violence, until he was satisfied. "They're falling back," Silas rumbled, lowering the rifle but keeping his thumb near the hammer. "The snow's too deep for a blind siege. They lost one, maybe two. They'll regroup in the timberline, but they won't rush a fortified cabin in the dark." He turned away from the window, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of years surviving on the razor's edge of the frontier. He grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from a chest, strode over to the shattered window, and nailed it over the frame with 3 vicious strikes of a hammer, blocking out the worst of the biting wind. Only then did he look down at the 2 shivering forms, huddled by his hearth. "Get up," Silas said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Clara scrambled to obey, her frozen joints screaming in protest. She pulled Lily up with her. The little girl's lips were tinted blue, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. Silas stepped closer, his massive frame blocking out the meager light of the dying fire. He smelled of cordite, old leather, and bitter cold. His gaze dropped to the dark, stiff stains covering the front of Clara's wool coat. "Are you hit?" he demanded. No, Clara stammered, wrapping her arms tighter around Lily. It's not mine. Silas didn't press for details. He didn't offer sympathies for the husband she had mentioned minutes ago. The frontier didn't care about grief. It only cared about who was bleeding out and who wasn't. He turned his back on them, grabbed an armful of split pine from a bin, and began aggressively feeding the hearth. "Take the coat off, both of you," he instructed, striking a match. The fire caught, casting dancing, erratic shadows across his rugged profile. "You'll freeze to death in wet wool. There are dry blankets on the bed. Wrap yourselves up and sit as close to the grate as you can tolerate." Clara didn't argue. Her survival instinct, honed sharp over the last 3 agonizing hours, told her to listen to the man who had just shot 2 people to protect them. She peeled the bloody, freezing coat off her shoulders, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud. She undid Lily's soaked outerwear with trembling, clumsy fingers, stripping the girl down to her cotton dress before burying her in a thick, scratchy quilt Silas had pointed to. She pulled a second blanket around her own shoulders and sank onto the braided rug, pulling Lily into her lap. Silas stood by the door, reloading his Winchester in the dim firelight. He pushed the brass cartridges through the loading gate one by one. Click, click, click. The sound was both terrifying and profoundly comforting. "Who are they?" Silas asked, his voice low and flat. Clara stared into the flames. "Bounty hunters, sent by Judson Croft." Silas's hands stopped moving. The name hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Even isolated on Table Mountain, Silas knew who Croft was. The man owned half the valley, a ruthless land baron who bought what he could and burned what he couldn't. "Croft doesn't send armed men into a blizzard for petty theft," Silas noted, his pale eyes pinning her to the floor. "What did you take from him?" "I didn't take anything," Clara said, her voice finding a sudden brittle edge. She looked up, meeting his terrifying gaze without flinching. "He took my husband's life. I just kept what belonged to us." She pressed her hand flat against her chest, right over her heart, where the crumpled land deed rested beneath her bodice. Silas stared at her for a long, calculating moment. He saw the exhaustion hollowing out her cheeks, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat, and the absolute unyielding defiance in her eyes. She was backed into a corner, terrified, but she wasn't broken. He broke the gaze first, returning to his rifle. "The pass down to the valley is blocked. This storm will dump another 3 feet before dawn. Nobody's getting up this mountain, and nobody's getting down. Croft's men will realize that by morning, if they haven't frozen to death already." He set the fully loaded Winchester against the wall within arm's reach of a worn leather armchair. "Sleep if you can, widow. I'll take the watch." Dawn arrived, not with sunlight, but with a creeping, bruised gray that seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. Clara woke with a sharp gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a fraction of a second, she was back in the timber line, running. Then the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee grounded her. She was lying on the floor, wrapped in a quilt. Lily was still asleep, tucked securely against Clara's side, her breathing finally steady and warm. Silas was sitting at a heavy oak table in the center of the room. He was nursing a tin cup of coffee, staring at the nailed-up blanket covering the window. He looked as though he hadn't moved an inch all night. "They're gone," Silas said, without turning his head. Clara slowly sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "How do you know?" "I went out an hour ago, found blood in the snow, a dropped shotgun, and tracks leading back down the ridge. The wind is already burying them." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. "They realized they couldn't break a siege in this weather. They'll wait it out in the valley, block the pass, and come back for you when the thaw hits." He finally turned to look at her. In the harsh, gray morning light, the lines around his eyes and mouth looked deeper, carved by years of harsh winters and carrying burdens he didn't speak of. "Which brings us to our arrangement," Silas said, his tone entirely devoid of warmth. Clara stiffened. She had known this was coming, No man risked the wrath of Judson Croft for a stranger without a price. She tipped her chin up, steeling herself. "I don't have money," Clara stated clearly. "Everything we had was tied up in the homestead Croft burned. But I am not helpless. I can work." Silas studied her. "The snow won't clear enough for a horse to navigate that pass for at least a month. Maybe longer. You and the girl can stay until the road is passable." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but Silas raised a thick, calloused finger, cutting off her gratitude. "But you will earn your keep," he continued, his voice hard and uncompromising. "I don't run a charity, and I don't tolerate dead weight. You will cook the meals. You will mend what's broken. You will muck the stalls and tend the horses when I am hunting or chopping wood. You do exactly what I say when I say it." He leaned forward, his massive shoulders casting a long shadow across the table. "And when the thaw comes, you leave. You take your daughter, you take your trouble, and you ride off this mountain. You do not ask me to ride down there with you. You do not ask me to fight Judson Croft. I saved your lives last night, widow. That is the beginning and the end of my charity. Do we have an agreement?" It was a cold, brutal, and entirely pragmatic offer. It stripped away any illusion of rescue and reduced their survival to a transaction. Clara looked at the hard, unforgiving set of his jaw. She looked at the bloodstains on her coat, crumpled in the corner. Then she looked at Lily sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. She stood up, letting the quilt fall from her shoulders. She smoothed down her wrinkled, soot-stained dress, walked over to the stove and picked up the heavy cast-iron coffee pot. She walked to the table and poured a measure of steaming black coffee into an empty tin cup. She took a sip, grimacing at the bitter, scalding strength of the brew, before meeting Silas's pale, icy gaze. "I need to know where you keep the oats for the horses, Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice perfectly steady. "I have stalls to muck." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps or begrudging respect, passed through Silas's eyes before he masked it completely. He nodded once, a sharp, curt motion. The agreement was struck. For the first 2 weeks, the blizzard ruled Table Mountain with an iron fist, burying the cabin under drifts so high they reached the eaves. Inside that claustrophobic, snowbound world, survival settled into a grueling, silent rhythm. Clara Hayes learned quickly that Silas Vance was a man of few words and zero compromises. He woke before the sun, a looming shadow in the freezing dark, and expected the stove to be burning and the coffee boiling by the time he pulled on his boots. She did not complain. She bound her bruised ribs tightly with torn strips of cotton, swallowed the lingering grief that threatened to choke her every time she closed her eyes, and worked. The barn became her domain. It was a sturdy, drafty structure built of rough-hewn pine, smelling sharply of manure, wet hay, and the deep, musky scent of Silas's 3 massive draft horses. Every morning, while Silas cleared the snow from the roof and hunted for whatever meager game had frozen in his traps, Clara mucked the stalls. She drove the heavy pitchfork into the soiled straw, her shoulders screaming in protest, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Her hands, which Thomas used to hold so gently, were rapidly transforming. The soft skin was tearing, yielding to angry red blisters that broke and scabbed over, only to crack again in the bitter cold. She was brushing down the large roan gelding, leaning her tired weight against the currycomb, when the barn doors hauled open. Silas stepped inside, bringing a swirl of snowflakes and the sharp scent of pine needles with him. He carried a heavy canvas sack over one shoulder, his face half hidden by a thick wool scarf and the pulled-down brim of his Stetson. He stopped, shaking the snow from his heavy coat, and his pale eyes immediately locked onto her. Clara paused, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She waited for a reprimand. She had learned that Silas watched her with the hawkish intensity of a man waiting for a weakness to expose itself. He expected her to shatter. He expected the weeping, fragile widow to demand rescue. Instead, Silas's gaze dropped to her hands. She was gripping the wooden handle of the brush so tightly her knuckles were white, but the split skin across her palms was weeping a faint mixture of blood and clear fluid, staining the wood. Silas's jaw tightened beneath his beard. He walked to the tack room, the heavy thud of his boots echoing against the floorboards. When he emerged, he was holding a small, dented tin. He didn't hand it to her. He set it on the top rail of the stall, keeping a deliberate distance between them. "Pine resin and beeswax," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the wind outside. "Clean the cuts with the boiled water tonight and rub that in. If your hands get infected, you're useless to me out here." It was an insult wrapped in a lifeline, delivered with his trademark coldness. Clara looked at the tin, then up at his guarded face. She didn't flinch, and she didn't offer a meek thank you. "They won't get infected, Mr. Vance," she said evenly, picking up the tin and slipping it into her apron pocket. "I'll have the rest of the stalls cleared before noon. The roan has a slight limp in his left hind quarter. You might want to check his frog for a stone." Silas stared at her. A heavy, charged silence stretched between them, thick with the scent of hay and horse sweat. He gave a single curt nod, stepping past her to inspect the horse. As he moved, his broad shoulder brushed against hers, a fleeting, accidental contact that sent an unexpected, jolting warmth straight through Clara's shivering frame. She stepped back instantly, her heart giving a sudden, erratic thump, and hurried back to her pitchfork. Silas didn't look back, but as he ran his massive hands down the roan's leg, his movements were fractionally slower, more deliberate than before. The physical labor was exhausting, but the evenings in the cabin were a different kind of trial. The space was too small for two adults trying desperately to ignore each other. After supper, usually a simple stew of salted pork, beans, and whatever root vegetables were left in the root cellar, Silas would retreat to his leather armchair by the fire, cleaning his rifle or whittling kindling with a razor-sharp hunting knife. Clara would sit at the table, mending Silas's torn work shirts with precise, aggressive stitches, acutely aware of the heavy, masculine presence filling the room. He took up so much space, not just physically but energetically, a coiled spring of a man, dangerous and quiet. The only bridge between their isolated islands was Lily. The 7-year-old had not spoken a single word since the night her father died. The trauma had locked her voice away, leaving her pale, watchful, and deeply anxious. But the mountain air and perhaps the undeniable fortress-like security of Silas Vance's cabin was beginning to bring color back to her cheeks. On their 12th night on the mountain, the wind finally died down, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Silas was sitting by the hearth, honing his knife on a whetstone. Shh, shh. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic. Lily slid off her chair at the table. She carried a small, cracked slate board and a nub of chalk Clara had found in a forgotten drawer. She padded silently across the braided rug in her thick wool socks, stopping exactly 2 feet away from Silas's chair. Silas stopped honing. He didn't look up immediately. He seemed to brace himself, as if the small child were a wild animal that might bite. Slowly he turned his head, his pale eyes fixing on the little girl. Lily didn't shrink away from his intimidating stare. She held out the slate. Silas stared at it, making no move to take it. He looked over Lily's head, shooting a dark, questioning glare at Clara. Clara simply kept her head down, her needle pulling thread through denim, letting him navigate the moment himself. With a low, almost imperceptible sigh, Silas laid his knife aside and took the slate with one massive, calloused hand. On the dark gray surface, Lily had drawn a surprisingly accurate, crude sketch of the cabin, the snowdrifts, and a large, blocky figure standing in front of it holding a long stick, clearly meant to be a rifle. Next to the big figure were 2 smaller ones. Silas looked at the drawing for a long time. The harsh lines around his mouth softened just a fraction of an inch, revealing a devastating glimpse of the man he might have been before the world turned him to stone. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small piece of charcoal he used to mark timber. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and carefully, meticulously, drew a lopsided, floppy-eared dog sitting next to the smallest figure. He handed the slate back. Lily looked at the dog. A tiny, fragile smile broke across her face. It was the first time Clara had seen her daughter smile in weeks. Lily tapped the dog with her finger, then pointed to Silas, silently asking a question. "Had a hound once," Silas muttered, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that Clara had to strain to hear. "Name was Barnaby. Useless for hunting, afraid of thunder, but he was a good listener." Lily nodded solemnly, satisfied with the answer. She turned and padded back to the table, clutching the slate to her chest. Silas watched her go, a ghost of an expression haunting his pale eyes. When he finally looked up, he found Clara watching him. For a heartbeat, the defenses between them dropped. Clara saw the profound, aching loneliness buried beneath his rugged exterior. Silas saw the fierce maternal gratitude shining in her exhausted eyes. It was a moment of pure, unguarded connection, striking hotter and deeper than any physical touch. Silas broke the gaze abruptly, his jaw clenching as he snatched up his knife and whetstone. The rhythmic shh resumed, louder and sharper than before, as if he could grind away the dangerous softness that had just slipped through his armor. Clara looked back down at her mending, her heart hammering a completely new rhythm against her bruised ribs. The blizzard outside was finally ending. But inside the cabin, the ice was just beginning to crack. The end of the blizzard did not arrive with a gentle, sunlit reprieve. It came with the relentless, maddening sound of dripping water. For 3 days, the temperature crept upward, turning the pristine, towering snowdrifts into heavy gray slush. The icicles clinging to the eaves of Silas Vance's cabin wept continuously, a ticking clock that echoed in Clara's chest. The thaw meant the pass would soon be clear, and the clear pass meant her time on Table Mountain was up. Silas had barely spoken a word since the night he drew the hound on Lily's slate. He had retreated behind his walls of ice and iron, spending his days repairing harnesses in the barn and his evenings sharpening tools that were already lethal. The unspoken reality of their arrangement hung between them, suffocating and heavy. On the 4th morning of the melt, Silas saddled his massive gray gelding. He wore his heavy duster, his Winchester slid securely into the saddle scabbard, and a Colt .45 strapped to his thigh. Clara stood on the porch, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching him tighten the cinch. The mountain air smelled of wet pine, churned mud, and impending separation. "The lower trail is washed out, but the ridge path should hold a horse," Silas said, not looking at her. He checked the action on his revolver with a sharp, mechanical click. "I'm riding down to the trading post at the Forks. Need salt and flour. I'll see if the road to the valley is passable for a wagon." "For you to leave," was the unspoken end of that sentence. Clara swallowed the hard knot in her throat. "How long will you be gone?" "By nightfall. Keep the door bolted. Don't light the lamps until I return." He finally turned to look at her. The winter sun cast harsh shadows across his cheekbones, making his pale eyes look like chipped flint. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the chapped, healing skin of her hands, before sweeping up to her face. "Keep the shotgun loaded, widow. Just because the snow is melting doesn't mean the mountain is safe." He swung into the saddle with a fluid grace that belied his size, and rode down the muddy trail without looking back. Clara watched him until he disappeared into the timberline, an acute, terrifying emptiness settling into her stomach. She ushered Lily inside and bolted the heavy oak door, leaving the cabin steeped in dim, nervous shadows. 10 miles below, where the mountain bled into the valley, the trading post at the Forks was a muddy, chaotic hub of trapped travelers and opportunistic drifters. Silas tied his gelding to the rail, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the instinct of a man who had survived a decade wearing a tin star. He pushed through the swinging doors of the mercantile. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies. He walked straight to the counter to place his order, but his peripheral vision caught something tacked to the rough-hewn timber board near the door. It was a fresh piece of paper, the ink barely dry. Silas walked over, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. "Wanted, dead or alive. Clara Hayes. For the murder of Thomas Hayes and grand larceny of property. Reward, $500. Payable by Judson Croft. Beneath the heavy black lettering was a crude but recognizable sketch of the woman currently making biscuits in his cabin. Silas stared at the paper, the muscles in his neck corded tight. Murder of Thomas Hayes. She had told him Croft's men killed her husband. But a $500 bounty was an astronomical sum, the kind of money that made honest men turn blind and bad men turn monstrous. It meant Croft wasn't just looking for a piece of paper. He was erasing the narrative. By framing Clara, Croft ensured that if she were caught, she wouldn't be taken to a judge. She would be shot in the back by a bounty hunter looking for an easy payday. Just went up yesterday, the store clerk muttered, wiping the counter with a dirty rag. Croft's foreman rode through, said the widow put a bullet in her own man, stole the deed to the farm, and ran off into the storm. Nasty business. Whole valley's looking for her. Silas didn't say a word. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gripping the edge of the wanted poster. With one violent jerk, he tore it from the wall, crumpled it into his fist, and shoved it deep into his duster pocket. He didn't wait for his supplies. He turned on his heel, the spurs on his boots biting into the floorboards, and strode out the door. He swung onto his horse and spurred the gelding hard, pushing the animal up the treacherous, muddy incline. "Keep the door bolted, widow," he prayed silently to a god he hadn't spoken to in a decade. "Keep it bolted." The afternoon sun was sinking behind the jagged peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the melting snow. Inside the cabin, the fire was burning low. Clara had spent the day mending and trying to keep Lily occupied with the slate board, but the oppressive silence of Silas's absence was gnawing at her nerves. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress with him in it, now felt like a wooden box. She needed to fetch more firewood before dark. "Stay here, Lily," Clara said, grabbing her shawl. "Don't unbolt the door for anyone but me." She stepped out onto the porch, the wet cold seeping instantly through her thin leather shoes. She walked to the woodshed, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The dripping water masked any other sounds. She gathered an armful of split pine, her breath pluming in the air. She turned to head back to the cabin, and froze. A man was standing between her and the porch. He wasn't Silas. He was lean, dressed in filthy buckskin, with a greasy, flat-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. A bounty hunter who had likely weathered the storm in a cave or an abandoned dugout, waiting for the thaw to pick up the trail. He held a Colt revolver down at his side, his mouth twisted into a jagged yellow smile. "Well now," the man drawled, his voice like grinding glass. "Ain't you a sight for sore eyes? $500, wrapped up in a pretty little shawl." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She dropped the firewood. The logs clattered loudly against the muddy ground. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, backing slowly against the rough wood of the shed. "Sure you do, Mrs. Hayes. Croft wants that paper you stole, and he wants you quiet." The man took a step closer, raising the revolver. He expected her to scream. He expected the weeping, terrified widow described on the wanted posters to drop to her knees and beg for her life. He expected completely wrong. Clara didn't scream. Her panic, sharp and blinding, suddenly crystallized into a cold, absolute focus. She hadn't spent her entire life as a farmer's wife. Before Thomas, before the quiet homestead, she had been Clara Higgins, the daughter of a ruthless Texas sheriff who believed his only child needed to know how to shoot a man before she knew how to read. Her hands, chapped and blistered from weeks of mucking stalls, moved with a terrifying, deeply ingrained muscle memory. Silas had told her to keep the shotgun loaded. She hadn't brought it outside. But she had brought the small, snub-nosed derringer she had kept hidden in her petticoat since the night Thomas died. In a fraction of a second, Clara's right hand slipped beneath her shawl. She drew the weapon, leveled it, and cocked the hammer in one fluid, unbroken motion. The bounty hunter's smile vanished. He tried to raise his Colt, his eyes widening in sudden, shocking realization. Bang! The gunshot tore through the quiet mountain air, echoing off the canyon walls. The heavy lead ball caught the bounty hunter high in the right shoulder. The impact spun him violently, his own gun discharging harmlessly into the mud before slipping from his numb fingers. He collapsed backward into a snowdrift, clutching his bleeding shoulder, screaming in agony and disbelief. Clara didn't drop the gun. She didn't faint. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the mud, and kicked his fallen revolver far out of his reach. She stood over him, the derringer still aimed squarely at his chest, her eyes dark, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. "If you move," Clara said, her voice steady and ice-cold, "the next one goes between your eyes." The sound of pounding hooves tore through the tree line. Silas Vance burst into the clearing, pulling back so hard on the reins that the gray gelding reared. He had heard the gunshot from a mile down the ridge and had ridden the rest of the way with his heart lodged in his throat, expecting to find her dead. He threw himself out of the saddle, his Winchester up and ready to fire. He stopped dead in his tracks. The scene before him defied every expectation he had ever held about the fragile widow. The bounty hunter was writhing in the mud, bleeding profusely. And Clara was standing over him, the smoke still curling from the barrel of her hidden gun, looking like an avenging angel carved from frontier justice. Silas slowly lowered his rifle, his pale eyes locked onto Clara. The air between them suddenly crackled with a completely different kind of tension. The mask of the helpless victim had shattered, revealing the lethal, capable woman underneath. Clara finally looked up at him. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline beginning to crash, but she didn't lower the weapon. "He was waiting by the shed," she breathed, her voice tight. Silas stepped forward, his heavy boots squelching in the mud. He looked at the bleeding man, then back down at Clara. The profound, shifting realization in his chest was a dangerous, exhilarating thing. He had spent 2 weeks trying to keep his distance from a fragile woman he thought he had to protect. He was suddenly realizing he was sharing his cabin with a woman who could fight right alongside him. Silas reached out and gently, so gently it contradicted everything about his massive, violent frame, wrapped his hand over hers, pushing the barrel of her gun down toward the earth. "I've got him, Clara," Silas rumbled, using her first name for the very first time. The sound of it on his lips was a dark, intimate promise. "I've got him." Silas Vance did not ask questions. He didn't demand to know where Clara had learned to shoot a man with the ice-cold precision of a frontier lawman. He simply took the smoking derringer from her trembling fingers and went to work. He hauled the groaning, bleeding bounty hunter into the muddy clearing, bound his hands and feet with thick hemp rope, and tossed him into the corner of the woodshed like a sack of feed. "You'll live," Silas growled, tying a tight tourniquet around the man's shoulder as he screamed through a mouthful of mud. "But if you make a sound that frightens that little girl inside, I'll finish what the widow started. Tomorrow, you walk back down this mountain, or you freeze. Your choice." When Silas finally stepped back into the cabin, the heavy oak door shutting out the dripping thaw, the silence inside was absolute. Lily was sitting on the braided rug, clutching her slate to her chest, her wide eyes darting between Silas and her mother. Clara stood by the wash basin. She had scrubbed her hands until the skin was raw and pink, but she was still shivering. The adrenaline that had turned her into a lethal weapon outside had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She gripped the edges of the washstand, her head bowed, fighting the dry sobs that threatened to tear their way out of her throat. She had sworn she would never touch a gun again after leaving Texas. But the frontier didn't care about promises. Silas unbuckled his gun belt and laid it on the table. The heavy thud of the leather seemed to break the spell in the room. He didn't go to his chair. He didn't retreat behind his walls of silence. He crossed the small cabin, his heavy boots making no sound on the floorboards, until he was standing directly behind her. Clara froze. She could feel the immense radiating heat of his body. He was so close she could smell the rain, the pine, and the dark scent of gun oil clinging to his duster. "I thought I was done with it," Clara whispered, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line down her soot-stained cheek. "I thought if I married a quiet man, lived a quiet life, the violence wouldn't follow me." "Violence doesn't track the man, Clara," Silas said, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated in her chest. "It tracks the land. You did what the land demanded to protect your own." He reached out. His hands, massive, scarred, and capable of tremendous destruction, were incredibly slow. He didn't grab her. He didn't spin her around. Gently, with an agonizing tenderness that made her breath hitch, Silas brushed the tangled, damp hair away from her neck. His rough fingertips traced the line of her jaw, the touch sending a shockwave of heat straight through her shivering frame. He let his hand rest against the nape of her neck, a warm, anchoring weight in a world that was spinning out of control. Clara leaned back just an inch, surrendering to the strength of his hand. She closed her eyes. There was no kiss. The air between them was too charged, too raw for something as simple as a kiss. It was an unspoken vow, forged in gunpowder and survival. It was a profound, terrifying intimacy that shattered the purely transactional nature of their agreement. "You're safe," Silas murmured, his thumb brushing the pulse point behind her ear. "As long as there's breath in my lungs, Clara, you're safe." From the rug, Lily watched them. The little girl didn't cry. For the first time since the night her father died, she lay her head down on the quilt, closed her eyes, and let herself sleep without fear. 3 days later, the mountain betrayed them. The mud had begun to harden into rutted tracks, and the air held the deceptive, fragile warmth of early spring. Silas had gone out before dawn, his face grim. He had spotted a column of black smoke rising from the lower ridge, a classic diversionary tactic, or a camp of craftsmen waiting for the mud to dry. "I'm going to scout the ridge," Silas had told her, checking his Winchester. "Bar the door. I'll be back before noon." But Silas Vance, the seasoned lawman, had underestimated the sheer, sprawling wealth of Judson Croft. Croft hadn't sent a handful of bounty hunters this time. He had sent an army, and they hadn't camped on the lower ridge. They had circled the mountain in the dark, using the timberline to mask their approach. It happened just before 10 o'clock. Clara was at the stove when the first warning came. Not a gunshot, but the panicked, high-pitched scream of the roan gelding in the barn. She dropped the cast-iron skillet. "Lily, get under the bed. Now!" Clara grabbed the shotgun Silas had left her and lunged toward the window, peering through a crack in the nailed-up blanket. What she saw made her blood run cold. A dozen men on horseback were swarming the clearing. They wore heavy dusters and carried repeaters, but they weren't aiming at the cabin. They had torches. "Burn the barn!" a man at the front shouted, a cruel-faced foreman with a silver star pinned mockingly to his lapel. "Smoke the rats out! Croft wants the paper. He doesn't care if it's got soot on it." Flames licked up the dry pine of the barn walls, catching the hay inside. The blaze roared to life with terrifying speed, painting the melting snow in violent, flickering orange. The horses inside kicked frantically at their stalls, their screams piercing the mountain air. Clara didn't think. The animals were Silas's livelihood. They were innocent. She unbolted the door and stepped out onto the porch, leveling the shotgun. "Let the horses out!" Clara screamed over the roar of the fire, firing a warning shot into the dirt near the foreman's horse. The riders scattered, but they didn't retreat. They had been waiting for her to open the door. 2 men, who had dismounted and flanked the cabin through the blind spot, kicked the front door open the rest of the way. Clara spun around, pumping the shotgun, but a heavy rifle butt cracked across her wrists. The gun clattered to the floorboards. Before she could reach for her derringer, strong hands grabbed her hair, dragging her to her knees on the porch. "Mama!" Lily's voice, the first word the child had spoken in 3 months, tore through the cabin. It wasn't a whisper. It was a shriek of absolute terror. A third man dragged the kicking, screaming 7-year-old out onto the porch by the scruff of her dress. "No, let her go!" Clara thrashed violently, but the man holding her pressed the barrel of a revolver hard against her temple. The foreman walked his horse closer to the porch, the heat from the burning barn casting demonic shadows across his face. He looked down at Clara, then at the sobbing child. "Judson Croft sends his regards, widow," the foreman sneered. "Here's the deal. We're taking the girl. You have until sundown tomorrow to bring the original deed to the saloon in town. You bring the paper, you get the brat. You tell the law, or you try to run, and we leave her in a shallow ditch." "Please," Clara begged, the Texas steel in her spine snapping as she watched a man tie Lily's hands with rough twine. Take me, leave her." "You're not the leverage," the foreman laughed. "The kid is." He hauled Lily up onto the saddle in front of him. The little girl looked back at Clara, her eyes wide, tears carving tracks through the soot on her face. "Mama," she cried again. "Lily, I'll come for you. I swear it," Clara screamed, fighting so hard her knees tore on the wood. But a heavy boot slammed into her ribs, knocking the wind out of her. The riders wheeled their horses around and galloped down the muddy trail, leaving Clara gasping on the porch, the roar of the burning barn drowning out her sobs. When Silas Vance rode back into the clearing an hour later, the world had ended. The barn was a smoldering black skeleton. The roof had caved in, sending plumes of thick, acrid gray smoke into the sky. The horses had managed to kick their way out of the weakened stalls and were huddled trembling at the edge of the timberline. But Silas didn't see the horses. He saw the smoke. He smelled the ash. A suffocating, paralyzing horror gripped him by the throat. Suddenly, he wasn't 52 years old on Table Mountain. He was a younger man, standing in front of his own burning homestead 15 years ago, listening to the screams of a wife and child he couldn't save. The PTSD hit him with the force of a physical blow. His vision tunneled. The Winchester slipped from his numb fingers and hit the mud. He staggered toward the cabin, his breathing ragged, shallow gasps. "Not again. God, please, not again." "Clara!" he roared, his voice cracking. He burst through the open door. The cabin was empty. The shotgun lay abandoned on the floor. A chair was overturned. Silas dropped to his knees in the center of the room, his massive shoulders shaking. He was a curse. He was a harbinger of death. Anyone who stood in his shadow was destined to burn. He buried his face in his rough, ash-stained hands, the agonizing weight of his past failures finally crushing the last of his spirit. Then he saw it. Propped up against the cast-iron stove, exactly where she knew he would look, was Lily's slate board. Silas crawled toward it, his hands trembling as he picked it up. Written in chalk, not in Lily's crude scrawl, but in Clara's elegant, hurried cursive, was a message. They took Lily. "They want the deed by tomorrow sundown at Croft's saloon. You sheltered us, Silas. You gave us warmth when the world gave us ice. Now let me protect you from this. I won't let your home burn anymore. I am going down there. I am getting my daughter back." Silas stared at the words. She hadn't been killed. She hadn't run away. She had gone straight into the jaws of hell to fight a war she couldn't win, simply to spare him the burden of fighting it for her. The paralyzing grip of the past shattered. Silas stood up. The crushing despair in his chest evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying rage. The old rancher who just wanted to be left alone died in that cabin. The frontier lawman, the man who had once brought an entire outlaw gang to its knees, woke up. He walked over to the heavy wooden chest beneath his bed. He kicked the lock off with the heel of his boot and threw the lid back. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were 2 bandoliers of ammunition, a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun, and the silver star he had sworn never to pin to his chest again. Silas Vance strapped the bandoliers across his broad chest. He picked up his Winchester from the mud outside, wiped the barrel clean, and whistled a sharp, piercing note for his gray gelding. "Hold on, Clara," Silas muttered to the empty clearing, his pale eyes burning with lethal intent as he swung into the saddle. "I'm coming." The mud of the valley town clung to Clara's boots like wet cement, but she did not slow her pace. She had ridden the exhausted roan gelding down the treacherous melting switchbacks of Table Mountain in half the time it usually took, driven by a maternal panic so absolute it had burned away the last of her physical exhaustion. The town of Oakhaven was a festering wound of a settlement, built on timber money and entirely owned by Judson Croft. The sun was sinking, bleeding red across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows over the muddy main street. Clara stopped in front of the Golden Spur Saloon. It was a sprawling two-story building that smelled of stale beer, cigar ash, and corrupt money. 3 of Croft's men stood on the boardwalk, rifles resting casually in the crooks of their arms. They watched her approach, their faces splitting into ugly, knowing grins. "Look what the thaw dragged in," the foreman sneered, stepping out from the swinging doors. He was the same man who had kicked her to the porch and taken her daughter. He held out a thick, calloused hand. "Any weapons, widow? Toss 'em. Croft's waiting." Clara reached into her apron pocket and dropped the small derringer into the mud at the foreman's feet. She didn't say a word. She kept her chin high, her spine rigid, channeling every ounce of her Texas upbringing. She patted her coat to show she was unarmed, her hand briefly pressing over the folded, blood-stained parchment hidden in her bodice. The foreman laughed, kicking the derringer aside. "Go on in, don't keep the boss waiting." Clara pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon was cavernous and suffocatingly hot. The piano was silent. The gambling tables were empty. The only patrons were Croft's hired guns, spread out along the walls and leaning against the mahogany bar, watching her like a pack of wolves circling a wounded doe. And at the center of the room, tied to a heavy oak chair, was Lily. "Mama!" Lily choked out, her voice raspy and broken. Her face was smudged with soot and tear tracks, her small wrists bound tightly with rope. Clara lunged forward, but 2 men stepped into her path, crossing their rifles to block her. "Ah, Mrs. Hayes, punctual. I appreciate that in a woman." The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely out of place in the gritty saloon. From the shadows of a corner booth stepped Judson Croft. He wasn't a rugged frontiersman. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a silk cravat, and a gold pocket watch that gleamed in the dim lamplight. He looked like a civilized gentleman, which made the casual brutality in his dark, flat eyes infinitely more terrifying. He walked toward Clara, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards. "Let my daughter go," Clara demanded, her voice vibrating with a fierce, suppressed rage. "I am here. You have me. Let the child walk out that door." "Let's not rush the negotiations, Clara." Croft smiled, stopping a few feet away. He pulled a silver cigar case from his breast pocket. "Your late husband, Thomas, was a very stubborn man. I offered to buy your farm for a fair price. He refused. He claimed the land was his legacy, but progress, unfortunately, cannot be halted by sentimentality. I need that valley for the new rail spur, which means I need the original deed with his signature, so my clerks can properly process the transfer." Croft lit his cigar, blowing a plume of gray smoke into the stagnant air. "Hand it over, and you and the girl can get on a stagecoach back to wherever you came from. Refuse, and I will bury you both next to Thomas." Clara looked at Lily. The little girl was shaking, her wide, terrified eyes locked on her mother. Clara's heart broke, but her resolve hardened into diamond. She reached into her coat, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the stiff parchment. She pulled the folded deed out. The blood on it, Thomas's blood, had dried into a dark, rusted brown. Croft's eyes lit up with a greedy, triumphant gleam. He reached out to take it, but Clara held it back. "Untie her first," Clara ordered. Croft sighed, waving a dismissive hand at the foreman. "Cut the brat loose. We have what we need." The foreman drew a hunting knife and sliced through the ropes binding Lily's wrists. The moment she was free, Lily scrambled out of the chair and sprinted across the room, burying her face in Clara's skirts, sobbing uncontrollably. Clara wrapped one arm fiercely around her daughter's head, pressing the child against her legs. With her other hand, she held the deed out. Croft snatched the parchment. He walked over to a card table beneath a hanging oil lamp, laying the heavy paper flat to inspect the seal and the signature. As he roughly unfolded the thick, triple-layered document, something slipped out from between the pages. It was a smaller, thinner piece of paper folded into a tight square. It fluttered to the floor, landing near the toe of Clara's boot. Croft didn't notice it. His eyes were hungrily scanning the legal jargon of the deed, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Perfect," he murmured. "Absolutely perfect." Clara looked down at the fallen square of paper. The handwriting bleeding through the thin vellum was unmistakable. It was Thomas's precise, meticulous cursive. Her husband had always been a meticulous record-keeper, a man who documented everything. Slowly, carefully, Clara bent down and picked the paper up. She unfolded it with one hand while holding Lily close with the other. It wasn't a part of their land deed. It was a page torn from a ledger, accompanied by a hastily written note in Thomas's hand. Clara's eyes scanned the words, and as she read, the breath was completely sucked from her lungs. The room around her seemed to vanish into a dizzying tunnel. "Secured a copy of Croft's private ledger from the county clerk," Thomas had written. "It proves what happened on Table Mountain 15 years ago. Croft paid the Miller gang to burn the Vance homestead. It wasn't a tragic accident. Croft ordered the fire to secure the high-altitude water rights before the railroad arrived. He murdered Silas Vance's wife and son." Clara stared at the ink until it blurred. Her heart stopped, then restarted with a violent, agonizing slam against her ribs. Silas. The image of the massive, broken rancher dropping to his knees in the ashes of his burned barn flashed through her mind. He had spent 15 years burying himself alive on that freezing mountain, crushed by the horrific belief that he had failed his family, that his enemies as a lawman had tracked him down, or that he was simply cursed. But it wasn't a curse. It was a ledger entry. It was a business transaction ordered by the man standing in front of her in a tailored suit. Suddenly, the universe shifted on its axis. The horrific blizzard that had nearly killed her, the blind, desperate run through the timberline, the specific, heavy oak door that Lily had collapsed against, none of it was a coincidence. Fate had not blown them off course. Fate had steered Clara directly to the mountain to deliver a 15-year-old reckoning into the hands of the only man who deserved to mete it out. Clara looked up. The fear that had kept her subservient evaporated, replaced by a white-hot, blinding fury. "You burned them," Clara whispered, her voice cutting through the smoky silence of the saloon like a razor. Croft looked up from the deed, frowning. "What did you say?" Clara stepped forward, holding the small piece of paper up. Her hand wasn't shaking anymore. "My husband didn't just refuse to sell his farm. He found your old ledgers. He found out what you did to secure the water rights on Table Mountain 15 years ago." The smug satisfaction drained entirely from Croft's face. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The hired guns along the walls shifted uncomfortably, gripping their rifles tighter. "He found out that you paid the Miller gang to lock a woman and a child in their house and burn it to the ground," Clara continued, her voice rising, ringing with the absolute authority of a judge reading a death sentence. "You murdered Silas Vance's family." The foreman swore under his breath, taking a step back. Everyone in the valley knew the legend of Silas Vance. They knew why the old sheriff had gone up the mountain, and they knew better than to ever wake the sleeping dragon. Croft's face contorted into an ugly, panicked mask. He looked at the paper in Clara's hand, then at his men. "Kill them," Croft barked, his voice cracking with sudden, desperate urgency. "Kill the widow and the brat! Burn that paper!" The men hesitated for a fraction of a second, the command to shoot a woman and a child momentarily stunning them. The foreman raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Clara's chest. Clara spun, throwing herself over Lily, bracing for the impact of the bullet, but the gunshot did not come from the foreman. It came from the front of the saloon. The heavy, swinging wooden doors didn't just open, they exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and shattered hinges, blasted off their frame by the deafening twin-barrel roar of a sawed-off shotgun. The blast caught the foreman perfectly in the chest, throwing him backward over a gambling table in a spray of blood and shattered cards. The saloon descended into absolute stunned silence. The smoke from the shotgun blast billowed through the ruined doorway, thick and acrid. Through the swirling smoke stepped a nightmare. Silas Vance filled the doorway, blocking out the dying red light of the sunset. He wore his heavy, mud-spattered duster. Twin bandoliers of heavy rifle ammunition were strapped across his broad chest in an X. In his massive hands, he casually broke open the smoking shotgun, the brass shells ejecting with a sharp clink, and snapped 2 fresh shells into the breeches with a terrifyingly fluid motion. But it wasn't the guns that made the men in the saloon freeze in sheer, unadulterated terror. It was what was pinned to the breast of his heavy coat. Gleaming dully in the dim saloon light, polished free of 15 years of tarnish, was the silver star of a United States frontier marshal. Silas's pale eyes, no longer hollow but burning with the cold, lethal fire of absolute vengeance, swept across the room. He didn't look at the hired guns. He didn't look at the blood on the floor. His gaze locked instantly onto Judson Croft. "Croft," Silas rumbled, a sound that vibrated the floorboards and chilled the marrow in Clara's bones. "Your lease on this valley just expired." The silence inside the Golden Spur Saloon was so absolute it felt like a vacuum, sucking the air right out of Clara's lungs. Silas Vance stood framed in the shattered doorway, the dying red light of the sun casting a bloody halo around his broad shoulders. The silver star pinned to his duster caught the dim light of the oil lamps, a shining beacon of a past he had resurrected for one singular purpose. Smoke curled lazily from the twin barrels of his sawed-off shotgun. Every man in the room was paralyzed, their eyes locked on the legend that had just kicked their front door off its hinges. Judson Croft broke first, his veneer of civilized composure shattered into raw animal panic. "Kill him!" Croft shrieked, his voice pitching high as he scrambled backward toward the mahogany bar, using his own hired guns as human shields. "Shoot him, damn you! $1,000 to the man who puts him down!" The spell broke. The saloon erupted into absolute, deafening chaos. Silas didn't flinch. As the first rifles were raised, he fired the second barrel of the shotgun, the concussive blast taking out 2 men near the piano, in a spray of splintered wood and broken glass. He tossed the empty shotgun aside, his massive hands moving with terrifying, practiced speed. In a heartbeat, he drew the heavy Colt .45 from his thigh holster and the Winchester from his back scabbard. Bullets chewed into the door frame around him, sending showers of splinters into the air. Silas stepped smoothly into the room, rolling his shoulder to avoid a wildly aimed shot, and began to fire. Crack, crack, crack. He didn't shoot wildly. He shot with the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had survived a dozen range wars. Every pull of the trigger found its mark. Clara didn't wait to be rescued. The moment the shooting started, she grabbed Lily by the waist and dove behind a heavy, overturned faro table. Bullets tore through the green felt above their heads, raining sawdust into their hair. "Stay down, Lily. Keep your hands over your ears and do not close your eyes," Clara commanded, her voice slicing through the thunderous noise. She pressed her daughter flat to the floorboards. Clara's heart was hammering a frantic rhythm, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. She was not the helpless widow Croft had assumed her to be. She was the daughter of a Texas sheriff, and she was done being a victim. Through the thick, choking cloud of gun smoke, Clara spotted the body of the foreman Silas had blasted through the doors. His loaded revolver lay in the mud just 3 feet away from her barricade. Clara took a breath, timed the rhythm of the gunfire, and lunged. She scrambled across the floor on her stomach, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy iron of the revolver. She pulled herself back behind the table just as a bullet shattered a whiskey bottle on the shelf behind her, showering her in amber liquid and glass. She checked the cylinder. 5 rounds left. Across the room, Silas was a force of nature. He was advancing slowly, inexorably, driving Croft's men back. But there were too many of them. A man appeared on the second-floor balcony, leaning over the wooden railing with a repeating rifle, taking dead aim at Silas's broad back. "Silas, above you!" Clara screamed. She didn't wait for him to turn. Clara rose from behind the table, leveled the heavy revolver with both hands, and pulled the trigger. The recoil snapped her wrists back, but the shot was true. The man on the balcony cried out, dropping his rifle before tumbling over the railing and crashing onto a roulette wheel below. Silas whipped his head around. Through the swirling smoke and flashing muzzle flares, his pale eyes locked onto Clara. He saw the gun in her hands. He saw the fierce, unyielding fire in her expression as she stood over her daughter, defending their ground. A profound, electrifying jolt of respect and raw, primal possessiveness surged through Silas's chest. She wasn't hiding behind him. She was fighting with him. Silas gave her a single sharp nod, a silent acknowledgement of their lethal partnership. The remaining hired guns, realizing they were caught in a crossfire between a legendary U.S. Marshal and a woman who didn't miss, lost their nerve. The three men left standing threw down their weapons and bolted for the back exit, shattering the rear windows in their desperation to escape the slaughter. Suddenly, the deafening roar of gunfire ceased, leaving behind a ringing, heavy silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the drip of spilled whiskey. The smoke began to clear. At the far end of the room, Judson Croft was backed against the shattered mirror of the bar. His tailored suit was covered in dust and blood. He was clutching a small pearl-handled derringer, his hand shaking so violently he could barely keep it aimed. Silas walked toward him. His boots crunched over broken glass and empty brass casings. He was bleeding from a graze on his left bicep, but he didn't even seem to notice. He moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of a glacier. "Stay back, Vance," Croft stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "I'll shoot! I swear to God I'll shoot!" Silas stopped 10 feet away. He didn't raise his weapons. He just stared at the man who had ordered the bounty on Clara's head. "You burned my barn, Croft," Silas rumbled, his voice dropping to a gravelly, terrifying whisper. "You put a gun to a child's head. You sent men to murder the woman under my protection. There isn't a hole deep enough in this territory for you to hide in." Clara stepped out from behind the faro table. She kept her revolver aimed at the floor, but her other hand clutched the torn ledger page. "Silas, wait." Her voice cut through the tension. Silas didn't take his eyes off Croft, but he paused. Clara walked across the ruined saloon, her boots stepping carefully over the debris. She stopped beside Silas. Without a word, she held out the folded piece of paper. Silas frowned. He kept his Colt leveled at Croft's chest, but he took the paper with his left hand and flicked it open. As Silas read Thomas Hayes's meticulous handwriting, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Clara watched Silas's face. She saw the exact moment the words registered. She saw 15 years of agonizing, soul-crushing guilt, the heavy, suffocating belief that he was a curse, that his past as a lawman had brought violence to his innocent wife and son, shatter into a million pieces. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't his fault. It was a calculated, cold-blooded business transaction ordered by the sweating, pathetic coward standing in front of him. Silas lowered the paper. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him pale as bone. The look in his eyes shifted from the cold calculation of a lawman to the absolute, fathomless rage of a father and husband who had finally found the architect of his 15-year nightmare. 15 years, Silas whispered. The sound was more terrifying than a scream. "I buried my wife and my boy. I buried myself on that mountain because you wanted the water rights." Croft let out a pathetic whimpering sound. "It was business, Vance. The railroad was coming. It was just business." "No," Silas said softly. "It was murder." In a final desperate act of cowardice, Croft raised his derringer and pulled the trigger. The small gun cracked. The bullet grazed Silas's ribs, tearing through his duster, but the massive rancher didn't even flinch. He didn't stumble. He simply raised his heavy Colt 45, locked his arm, and fired a single thunderous shot. The bullet struck Croft dead center in the chest. The land baron was thrown backward by the impact, crashing through the shattered bar mirror in a shower of silver glass before sliding to the floor, dead before his polished shoes stopped twitching. The war for Table Mountain was over. Silas stood perfectly still for a long moment, the smoke from his revolver curling into the air. He looked at the body of Judson Croft, and slowly, the tension that had locked his spine for a decade and a half began to uncoil. The ghosts that had haunted his cabin were finally, irrevocably laid to rest. He uncocked the Colt and slid it back into its holster. A small, terrified whimper broke the silence. Silas turned. Lily had crawled out from behind the table. She was staring at the blood, at the destruction, shivering uncontrollably. Silas dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the ruined saloon. He didn't care about the glass or the blood or the men groaning on the floor. He held out his massive, calloused arms. Lily didn't hesitate. She ran across the room and threw herself into Silas's chest, wrapping her small arms around his thick neck, sobbing openly into his duster. Silas closed his eyes, wrapping one arm tightly around the little girl, burying his face in her hair. Clara stood a few feet away, her own tears finally spilling over. She dropped the empty revolver to the floor. Her knees buckled, the adrenaline finally leaving her body. But before she could hit the ground, Silas's free arm shot out and caught her. He pulled Clara down to her knees beside him, wrapping his arm around her waist, hauling her flush against his chest. For a long moment, the three of them knelt together in the wreckage, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Silas pulled back just enough to look at Clara. His pale eyes were no longer flinty and cold. They were incredibly warm, shining with an emotion so deep and profound it stole her breath. He reached up, his rough, scarred thumb gently wiping a mixture of soot and tears from her cheek. "You rode down that mountain," Silas rasped, his voice thick with awe. "You rode straight into hell to protect me from my own past." "You sheltered us," Clara whispered, resting her forehead against his chin, her hands gripping the lapels of his duster. "You saved us, Silas. I wasn't going to let him take anything else from you." Silas stared at her mouth, his chest heaving. The distance between them, the walls of ice, the pragmatic agreements, the fear of the past, was gone. "I told you to leave when the thaw came," Silas murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I know," Clara breathed, her heart hammering against his. "I'm not leaving." "Good." Silas didn't hesitate anymore. He slid his hand to the back of her neck, tangling his thick fingers in her hair, and pulled her mouth to his. It was a kiss born of gunpowder, ash, and absolute desperation. It was rough and bruising, tasting of salt and smoke, carrying all the unspoken words they had swallowed over the last month. Clara let out a soft, shattered sound and kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands sliding up his broad chest to wrap around his neck. It was a promise forged in the fires of survival, a branding of two souls who had finally found their missing pieces in the most broken of places. When Silas finally pulled back, he was breathing hard, resting his forehead against hers. He kept his arms securely around her and Lily, holding them as if he would never let them go. "You're not going anywhere, Clara," Silas vowed, the gravelly rumble of his voice sealing their fate. "The thaw is over. This is home." Spring arrived on Table Mountain not with a whisper, but with a vibrant, breathless rush of life. The suffocating, towering snowdrifts that had once formed Clara's icy prison had melted away, swelling the creeks and turning the harsh granite slopes into rolling carpets of emerald grass and purple lupine. The air no longer smelled of wood smoke and fear. It smelled of damp earth, pine sap, and wild sweetgrass. On the eastern edge of the clearing, the charred, skeletal remains of the old barn were gone. In their place stood the golden, freshly hewn timber frame of a new one. Silas had spent the last 2 months cutting the pine himself, his massive shoulders swinging the broadaxe with a steady, rhythmic pace that had eluded him for 15 years. He wasn't just building a barn, he was building a future. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, smoothing the skirt of her dress. It wasn't silk or satin, but a simple, beautifully tailored cornflower blue cotton she had bought in the newly liberated town of Oakhaven. Her hands, resting lightly on the porch rail, were completely healed. The angry, weeping blisters from the winter were gone, leaving behind only faint, silvery scars, quiet testaments to the price she had paid for her family's survival. The cabin door opened behind her. Silas stepped out into the morning sun, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Gone was the mud-caked duster and the heavy bandoliers. The silver star was locked away in the chest beneath the bed, its purpose served. Today, the legendary frontiersman wore a crisp white linen shirt, a dark vest, and clean denim. His thick silver-threaded hair and beard had been neatly trimmed. He looked impossibly broad, ruggedly handsome, and completely, breathtakingly, entirely hers. He stopped beside her, his pale eyes catching the sunlight, softening into the color of a clear summer sky. He reached out, his massive calloused hand wrapping gently around hers. "You look beautiful, Clara," Silas rumbled, the gravelly depth of his voice vibrating with a tenderness that still managed to make her heart skip a beat. "And you look like a man who cleans up remarkably well for a mountain hermit," she teased softly, leaning her cheek against his shoulder. A quiet chuckle rumbled deep in his chest. Silas Vance, the man who had spent a decade and a half locked in a fortress of grief, was smiling. From the edge of the clearing, the circuit judge, a decent man who had ridden up from Oakhaven now that Croft's corrupt shadow had been lifted from the valley, tied his horse to a fresh spruce post. He dusted off his coat and walked toward the porch with a warm grin. But it was the small figure running ahead of him that made Silas and Clara turn. Lily bounded up the porch steps wearing a new yellow dress that caught the mountain breeze. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color, and the haunted, terrified shadow that had darkened her eyes all winter had completely vanished. She stopped in front of Silas, looking up at the towering rancher. She didn't hold a slate board anymore. She didn't need one. "The judge is here," Lily announced, her voice clear, sweet, and bursting with excitement. She reached out and took Silas's large, rough hand in her two small ones. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Are you ready, Dad?" Silas's chest hitched. Even after 2 months of hearing it, the words still struck him with the force of a physical blow, cracking open the last remaining reserves of love he had thought were buried forever in the ashes of his past. He knelt down, the joints of his knees popping until he was at eye level with the 7-year-old girl who had knocked on his door and saved his life. He brought his other hand up, gently cupping Lily's cheek. "I've been ready since the night you walked into my cabin, little bird," Silas whispered fiercely. He stood up, wrapping one strong arm around Lily's shoulders and offering the other to Clara. Together, the three of them walked to the center of the sunlit porch. The vows were short, spoken without the need for grand poetry. The frontier didn't demand flowery words. It demanded truth. When the judge asked for the rings, Silas slid a simple polished band of rose gold onto Clara's scarred finger. He looked down into her dark, fierce eyes. The eyes of the woman who had stood between him and an army, who had fought with a derringer in the mud to protect his sanctuary. "I promise to keep you safe, Clara," Silas vowed, his voice low and incredibly steady, meant only for her. "Now, I vow to keep you happy. Every day the sun rises over this mountain, until it sets for the last time." "You are my home, Silas," Clara whispered back, sliding a matching band onto his thick finger. "You are my heart's quiet place." When the judge finally smiled and said the words, Silas didn't hesitate. He pulled Clara flush against his chest, his large hands cradling her face, and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, gunpowder-laced kiss of their survival in the saloon. It was slow, deep, and impossibly sweet. A promise of warm fires, safe nights, and a love that was stronger than any storm. Behind them, Lily cheered, the sound echoing off the granite peaks, bright and unbroken. 15 years later. The rocking chair groaned a familiar rhythmic tune against the floorboards of the sprawling wraparound porch. Silas Vance sat with his long legs stretched out, his boots resting on the lower rail. Time had turned the silver in his hair to pure, striking white, and carved the lines around his eyes a little deeper, but the sheer, imposing breadth of his shoulders remained. He radiated the calm, unshakable strength of an ancient oak tree that had weathered every storm and finally found the sun. Beside him, sitting on a cushioned love seat, was Clara. She was as beautiful at 47 as she had been at 32. The harshness of her early life had been smoothed away by a decade and a half of absolute security and profound love. She held a mug of steaming coffee, her head resting comfortably on Silas's broad shoulder. Silas's large, calloused hand rested over hers on the armrest, his thumb absently stroking the rose-gold band on her finger. Together they looked out over the property. The small, isolated cabin had been expanded into a thriving, beautiful ranch. The new barn was filled with healthy horses, and the paddock stretched down the lush green slope toward the valley. In the center corral, the dust was kicking up under the late afternoon sun. Lily, now 22, sat tall and proud in the saddle of a spirited buckskin mare. She wore worn denim, a leather vest, and a Stetson pulled low, looking every inch the fierce, capable woman she had grown into. She was laughing, holding a coiled lariat in one hand. Standing on the fence rail, shouting eagerly, was a 14-year-old boy. Elias Vance had his mother's dark, intelligent eyes, and his father's thick, unruly hair and broad jaw. "You're throwing it entirely from your wrist, Eli," Lily yelled over the sound of the stamping hooves, spinning the loop of her rope with effortless grace. "Dad taught you better than that. You have to use your whole shoulder. Watch!" With a flick of her arm, the lasso sailed through the air, dropping perfectly over the wooden training post in the center of the ring. Elias groaned playfully, jumping down from the fence to retrieve it. On the porch, Silas watched his children. A deep, resonant warmth expanded in his chest, so vast and complete it felt like it might break his ribs. He looked down at Clara. She was already watching him, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. She shifted closer, her fingers lacing tightly through his. "They're good kids," Silas murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble. "They had a good father to show them how," Clara replied softly, pressing a kiss to the thick, scarred knuckle of his thumb. Silas looked back out at the corral. He thought about the man he had been 15 years ago, the hollowed-out ghost sitting in the freezing dark, waiting to die, believing the world had nothing left to offer him but punishment. Then he thought about the storm, the blood on the snow, and the terrifying, beautiful woman who had refused to let him hide from the light. Family, Silas had learned, wasn't just blood. It was the people who braved the blizzard for you. It was the people who stood beside you when the bullets started flying and who stayed to help you sweep up the glass when the smoke cleared. Silas wrapped his arm around Clara's waist, pulling her flush against his side, as the golden hour of the sunset washed the mountain in a brilliant, fiery light. "You know," Silas whispered, his pale eyes entirely at peace as he watched Lily pull her little brother up onto the back of her horse. "The day she pounded on that heavy oak door and cried, I thought the sky was falling." He pressed his lips to the crown of Clara's head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Turns out," the old rancher smiled, "it was just opening up a whole new world." This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.